The battlefield was quiet now. The screams had faded, and the smoke from burning ships drifted through the cold air. Captain Elias Voss stepped carefully over the rubble, his pulse steady, his rifle held close. The war between humans and the Xilari had been raging for years, and this was just another battle. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, humans and Xilari alike. The Xilari were a proud, warrior species known for their advanced technology and brutal tactics. They had once enslaved humanity, treating them as nothing more than tools. But humans had fought back, and now the war had turned in their favor. Elias sighed, his breath visible in the icy air. His mission was simple: search for survivors, collect any useful data, and leave. But as he moved past a wrecked Xilari fighter, he heard something. Soft, weak, but unmistakably a voice. A survivor. His grip tightened on his rifle as he followed the sound. Behind a fallen metal beam, half buried in debris, lay a Xilari girl. She was different from the others he had seen. Her armor was cracked, her pale blue skin bruised. She looked young, barely past adulthood by human standards. Her silver eyes flickered open as she struggled to move. Elias hesitated. He had every reason to leave her there. The Xilari had taken everything from humanity: lives, freedom, dignity. They had shown no mercy. Why should he? But he didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he crouched down and reached out. "Can you move?" The girl blinked at him, dazed. Her lips trembled, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You are human." Elias nodded. "That's right." Her body shivered, and she lowered her head. "Then, finish it. I am Xilari, your enemy." Elias frowned. He had seen many soldiers die, but something about the way she spoke felt different. She wasn't begging for her life. She was accepting death, as if she expected nothing else. He glanced around. No other Xilari were nearby. She was alone. With a sigh, Elias slung his rifle over his shoulder and pulled a small medical kit from his belt. "I'm not killing you," he said. "You're hurt. If I leave you here, you'll die." Her silver eyes widened in shock. "You would save me?" "Looks like it." He carefully removed a piece of debris from her leg. She flinched but did not cry out. Her species was tough, but even they had limits. As he worked, she watched him, confusion clear on her face. Finally, she whispered, "No human has ever spared a Xilari before." Elias smirked. "Then I guess I'm the first." Silence stretched between them as he bandaged her wounds. When he finished, he met her gaze. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then said softly, "Kazira." "Well, Kazira, you're coming with me. Can you stand?" She struggled, and Elias reached out to help. She stiffened at his touch but allowed it. As she leaned on him for support, her voice trembled. "If you will not take my life, then take me as your slave." Elias stopped. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What?" Kazira's head bowed low, her voice steady despite her injuries. "You saved my life. Among my people, a life debt must be repaid. I am yours now. A slave forever." Elias stared at her in disbelief. Humanity had fought so hard to free themselves from Xilari rule. And now one of them was offering to become his servant. His jaw tightened. "That's not how we do things." Kazira looked up, confusion in her silver eyes. "But I owe you everything." Elias sighed. He could already hear the arguments waiting for him back on the ship. His crew would never trust her. And yet, as he looked at her, wounded, lost, and bound by a belief that had ruled her people for centuries, he knew one thing for certain. She wasn't his enemy anymore. "You don't owe me anything," he said firmly. "I don't need a slave. But if you want to live, then come with me." Kazira hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Elias tightened his grip on his rifle and led her forward. The war wasn't over. The past couldn't be erased. But maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. And for the first time, Kazira followed a human, not as a master, but as something else entirely. The starship Vanguard floated in the vast darkness of space, its engines humming softly as it drifted near the ruins of the Bat. Lefield. Inside, Captain Elias Voss walked through the dimly lit corridors, his boots echoing with each step. Behind him, Kazira followed silently. Her movements were slow, her injured legs still weak, but she kept pace. Despite her wounds, her posture remained straight, her head held high. Yet something about her seemed uncertain. As they reached the medical bay, the door slid open with a quiet hiss. Elias gestured for her to enter. "Sit. I'll call the doctor." Kazira obeyed, lowering herself onto the examination table. But before Elias could step away, she lowered her head and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "You have not given me orders." Elias frowned. "What?" She lifted her gaze, silver eyes filled with confusion. "I told you, I am your slave now. My life belongs to you. Yet you treat me as if I am." She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Free." Elias exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because you are." Kazura's brow furrowed. "No, that is not how it works. Among my people, when a life is saved, a debt must be repaid. The one saved becomes a servant to their savior." She paused. "And yet you ask for nothing." Elias crossed his arms. "Maybe humans don't think like that." She tilted her head slightly. "Then how do humans repay a life debt?" He was silent for a moment. Then finally he said, "We don't keep slaves. We help each other because it's the right thing to do. No payment needed." Kazura's expression remained unreadable. The idea was so foreign to her that she did not know how to respond. Before she could say more, the door slid open again. A woman in a white medical coat entered. Dr. Calloway, the ship's chief medic. Her gaze flicked to Kazira, then to Elias, suspicion clear in her eyes. "Auxiliary?" she asked, crossing her arms. "She's injured," Elias said simply. Dr. Calloway narrowed her eyes but sighed and grabbed a scanner. "Fine. But if she tries anything, I'm sedating her." Kazira sat still as the doctor examined her wounds. She could feel the tension in the air. Humans did not trust her. It was expected. After all, her people had once ruled them as slaves. After a few minutes, the doctor stepped back. "Nothing serious. She just needs rest." She turned to Elias. "Captain, can I talk to you outside?" Elias glanced at Kazira, then nodded. "Wait here." As the door shut behind them, Calloway crossed her arms. "What are you thinking, bringing her here?" "She's not a threat," Elias replied. "She's auxiliary," Calloway argued. "Her kind enslaved us for years. Some of our crew lost family in those mines." Elias met her gaze. "I know, but I won't leave someone to die just because of their species." Calloway sighed. "I hope you're right about her." Elias nodded and stepped back inside. Kazira was still seated, her posture rigid. She watched him carefully. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you where you can stay." The crew quarters were small, but they were clean and functional. Elias opened the door to an empty room. "This is yours," he said. Kazira stepped inside slowly, glancing around. There was a bed, a small desk, and a storage compartment. It was simple, but it was more than she expected. "You are giving me my own space?" she asked, turning to him. Elias leaned against the doorframe. "Yeah." "Why?" She hesitated. "I expected to sleep on the floor, or in a cage." Elias sighed. "That's not how we treat people here." Kazira lowered her gaze, deep in thought. She had spent her entire life believing that among themselves, throwing suspicious glances toward the new guest aboard their ship. Kazira, the lone auxiliary, walked silently through the corridors, her sharp senses picking up every murmur, every glare. She had expected this. Humans had every reason to hate her people. The Scifi had once enslaved them, forced them to mine, build, and serve without question. Now, the war had turned, and humans were no longer the victims. And yet, despite all of that, Captain Elias Voss had saved her life. She still did not understand why. Kazira kept her head high as she entered the mess hall. The low chatter died instantly. Every human inside went quiet, their eyes locked onto her. She ignored them. She had learned long ago that showing weakness only invited attack. Taking a food tray, she sat at an empty table and started eating. At the far side of the room, a tall, muscular man with a scar across his cheek watched her with a cold stare. Lieutenant Darius Kane. Kazira had heard his name before. He was Elias' second-in-command, and one of the strongest fighters aboard the ship. He stood up and walked toward her table. The crew watched, waiting. Kazira did not react as he stopped beside her. "You shouldn't be here," Kane said, his voice calm but firm. Kazira finished chewing her food before replying. "Captain Voss says otherwise." Kane's jaw tightened. "You think just because the captain saved you, we'll trust you?" Kazira met his gaze. "No, I do not expect trust." Kane narrowed his eyes. "Then what do you expect?" She hesitated. That was a question she did not have an answer to. Finally, she said, "I do not know. I only know that I am alive because of your captain, and I intend to honor that." Kane leaned in slightly. "Honor? Auxiliary talking about honor." His voice turned sharp. "Tell me, where was your honor when your people put my father in chains?" Kazira did not flinch. She could feel the weight of his anger, the bitterness in his voice. "I was not there," she said quietly. "That doesn't matter." Kane's voice was low, dangerous. "Your people took everything from us. I don't care what Elias says. You don't belong here." Kazira placed her hands on the table. "Then kill me." A ripple of shock passed through the room. Kane's fists clenched, his body tense. Kazira looked him in the eye. "I will not fight you. If my death will satisfy your anger, then take my life now." For a long moment, Kane did not move. His breathing was heavy, his fists shaking. But he did not strike her. Instead, he stepped back, shaking his head. "You're not worth it." Then he turned and walked away. Kazira exhaled slowly, realizing that the entire mess hall was still silent. Then, one by one, the crew returned to their meals. The tension remained, but the moment had passed. Kazira picked up her tray and continued eating. Meanwhile, in the captain's quarters, Elias sat at his desk, reviewing mission reports when the door chimed. "Come in," he said. The door slid open, and Kane stepped inside. Elias leaned back in his chair. "Let me guess, you had a little chat with Kazira?" Kane crossed his arms. "She's dangerous, Elias." "She's unarmed and injured," Elias countered. Kane shook his head. "That's not what I mean. She's dangerous because she doesn't belong here. The crew won't accept her, and I won't either." Elias exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I get it, Darius, but I couldn't just leave her to die." Kane's voice hardened. "Why not?" Elias looked up at him. "Because we're not them." Kane went silent. Elias leaned forward. "You think I don't remember what the Scifi did to us? I do. I lost people too, Darius. But if we start acting like them, deciding who deserves to live and die based on their species, then what are we fighting for?" Kane's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue. He wanted to fight back. But Elias' words struck something deep within him. Finally, he sighed. "Just don't expect me to trust her." Elias gave a small, tired smile. "I wouldn't expect anything else." Kane turned to leave but paused at the door. "She's not weak, Elias. Watch your back." With that, he was gone. Later that night, in the darkness of her small room, Kazira sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. She had always believed strength came from control, from power, from never showing weakness. But today, she had chosen not to fight. And yet, she was still alive. Perhaps humans were stronger than she had thought. Perhaps Elias Voss was stronger than she had ever imagined. And for the first time, she wondered, what if she had been wrong all along? The Vanguard cruised through the vast emptiness of space, its engines humming steadily. Inside, the tension remained thick. Kazira could feel it everywhere. The stares, the whispers, the unspoken distrust. Days had passed since her encounter with Lieutenant Kane in the mess hall, yet nothing had changed. The crew avoided her, treating her as an unwelcome shadow. It didn't bother her, not in the way they might have hoped. She had lived among warriors all her life. She understood hostility. But there was something new within her, a question she could not escape. Why did she care? She had spent her life believing humans were weak, that their emotions made them easy to manipulate. And yet, Elias Voss had shown her a strength unlike anything she had ever seen, a strength that did not come from force, but from something else. Trust. But trust was a fragile thing, and she was about to be tested. All crew report to the bridge. We have a situation. The voice of Captain Elias Voss echoed through the ship's comms. Kazira stood from her bunk, adjusting the simple uniform she had been given. It was plain, unlike the decorated armor of the Xilari, but she had grown used to it. As she entered the bridge, she immediately noticed the sharp tension in the air. The crew worked quickly at their stations, their eyes darting to the main screen. A Xilari warship hovered in the distance. Kazura felt her chest tighten. Elias stood at the center of the room, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable. Beside him, Lieutenant Kane was glaring at the screen. Kazura took a step forward. "They are searching for me." Kane scoffed. "Of course they are." Elias turned to her. "Can they track you?" Kazura shook her head. "Not unless I send a signal." Kane let out a cold laugh. "And how do we know you haven't already?" Kazira met his gaze without flinching. "Because if I had, we would already be dead." The room fell silent. Elias studied her carefully. He had learned to read people over the years. Kazira was a trained warrior. She knew how to lie, how to manipulate. But at this moment, she wasn't. He nodded. "Then we need to move before they detect us." "Too late," one of the crew members said. "They're hailing us." Elias exhaled. "Put them through." The screen flickered, and Xilari commander appeared. His dark silver armor gleamed under the ship's cold lights. His face was sharp, his glowing yellow eyes filled with authority. "I am Commander Zoreth of the Xilari Dominion," he announced, his voice deep and commanding. "We have detected a traitor aboard your vessel. Surrender her immediately, and we will allow you to leave unharmed." Kazira clenched her fists. She recognized him. Zoreth had been one of the generals responsible for humanity's enslavement. Elias took a step forward. "We don't have a traitor." Zoreth's gaze flicked toward Kazira. His expression darkened. "Kazira, you are a disgrace to your people. You would side with these humans." Kazira did not respond immediately. For the first time, she realized something. If she returned with the Xilari, they would not welcome her back. They would punish her. She had been saved by a human, spared when she should have died. In their eyes, she was weak. Her life in the Dominion was over. She lifted her chin. "I do not serve you anymore." A deadly silence followed. Zoreth's face darkened. "Then you are nothing." The transmission ended. The alarms blared. "They're charging weapons." A crew member shouted. Elias snapped into action. "Shields up. Prepare for evasive maneuvers." The Vanguard shook as the first blast struck. The crew scrambled, responding quickly, but Kazira remained frozen. Her people were trying to kill her. Her own people. She had spent her life believing she was part of something greater, part of an empire that valued strength above all else. But now, she saw the truth. They had never valued her. Not the way Elias did. Not the way these humans did. A choice stood before her. She could remain silent, allow the humans to fight her battle, or she could fight beside them. Kazira turned to Elias. "Let me help." Cain scoffed. "Oh, now you want to help." Elias ignored him. His gaze locked onto hers. "How?" Kazira's mind raced. "I know auxiliary attack patterns. I know how they fight." She stepped forward. "And I know how to stop them." Elias hesitated. He had been prepared to protect her, to fight off that auxiliary and escape. But this was something different. This wasn't about saving Kazira anymore. This was about letting her stand on her own. Finally, he nodded. "Then let's end this." Kazira turned to the tactical station. The humans still didn't trust her, but for the first time, she didn't care. She wasn't here to prove herself. She was here to fight. For the first time in her life, Kazira was truly free, and she would never go back. The vanguard shook violently as another blast from the auxiliary warship struck its shields. Alarms blared, red lights flashing across the bridge as the crew worked frantically. The ship wasn't built for war. It was fast, agile, but it couldn't win a head-on battle with an auxiliary destroyer. Kazira stood at the tactical station, her mind racing. The crew didn't trust her, and she knew they had no reason to. But right now, trust didn't matter. Survival did. "They're aiming for our engines," one of the crew members called out. Elias gritted his teeth. "Can we outrun them?" "No, Captain," the helmsman replied. "They're faster." Kazira's sharp eyes scanned the enemy's movements on the display. She could see it, the attack pattern, the way the auxiliary were moving. It was predictable. She had trained under their best tacticians. She knew their strategies better than anyone here. "They'll disable your ship before boarding," she said firmly. "They won't destroy you outright. They'll want prisoners." Cain gave her a sharp look. "And how exactly do you know that?" Kazira met his gaze without hesitation. "Because that's what I would do." Elias turned toward her. "Then tell me how to stop them." For a moment, she hesitated. She was betraying her own people. No, they had already betrayed her. They had abandoned her the moment she became weak. Now she fought for herself. She stepped closer to the main screen, pointing at a section of the enemy ship. "Their shield emitters are here and here. Auxiliary shields are strong, but they have a delay between pulses. If you time your attack right, you can break through." Cain scoffed. "And what? You expect us to take your word for it?" Kazira ignored him and looked directly at Elias. "You saved my life. Now, let me help you." Elias studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "Weapons, lock onto those coordinates. Fire when ready." The crew hesitated but followed his order. A moment later, the Vanguard's cannons roared to life, sending a precise barrage of energy straight into the auxiliary warship's weak points. A massive explosion rippled across the enemy shields. Sparks flew as the ship trembled under the impact. Kazira's strategy had worked. The bridge erupted into activity. "Their shields are failing," a crew member shouted. Elias didn't waste time. "Target their weapon systems. Disable them before they recover." Another volley of fire struck the auxiliary warship, hitting its primary cannons. Explosions burst from its hull, and the enemy ship's lights flickered. Then, the auxiliary made their decision. "They're retreating," the helmsman reported. "They're charging their jump drive." Elias exhaled. "Let them go." Kazira watched as the auxiliary ship vanished into hyperspace. The battle was over. But her war was just beginning. The bridge fell into silence. The immediate danger had passed, but the tension remained. She had just helped humans defeat her own people. Cain was the first to speak. "So what now?" His voice was laced with suspicion. "She's proven she can fight. But that doesn't change what she is." Kazira turned to him, her expression unreadable. "And what am I?" Cain's eyes narrowed. "Auxiliary." Kazira stepped forward. And yet, when your enemies attacked, who stood beside you? Kane clenched his jaw, but he had no answer. Elias finally broke the silence. She saved us today. That's all that matters. He turned to Kazira. You didn't have to help. You could have stayed silent, let us lose. But you didn't. Kazira took a deep breath. I made my choice. Elias nodded. Then you're one of us now. The crew exchanged uncertain glances, but no one protested. For the first time in her life, Kazira wasn't just fighting to survive. She had found something worth fighting for, and she wasn't turning back. The Vanguard floated in the silence of space, its crew still recovering from the battle. The smell of burnt circuits lingered in the air, and repair teams rushed through the corridors, fixing damaged systems. The auxiliary warship was gone, but its presence still weighed heavily on everyone's mind. Kazira sat in a quiet corner of the ship's observation deck, staring at the stars. The battle had proven something. She had chosen her side. But had the humans truly accepted her? She had saved them. She had given them the key to victory. But even now she could feel the weight of their suspicion, the silent stares in the corridors. One victory would not erase their hatred. The door behind her hissed open. She turned her head slightly as Elias Voss entered, his usual calm expression in place. He leaned against the railing beside her, looking out at the stars. You haven't spoken much since the battle, Elias said. Kazira exhaled slowly. There is not much to say. Elias studied her for a moment. You saved this crew. She nodded but did not smile. And yet, they still see me as an enemy. Elias sighed. It's not that simple. You know what your people did to us. I know, she said quietly. I never expected them to forgive me. Elias was silent for a moment, then said, They don't have to forgive you, but they do have to see you. Right now, all they see is a auxiliary. Kazira turned to face him. And what do you see? Elias met her gaze. I see someone who could have let us die, but didn't. She held his stare for a long moment before looking away. That is not enough for them. No, Elias admitted. But trust isn't built in a day. You made the first step. Now you have to take the next. Before she could respond, the ship's alarm blared through the halls. Captain to the bridge, the comm system called out. Elias gave Kazira a meaningful look before heading out. After a moment's hesitation, she followed. When they reached the bridge, Lieutenant Kane was already there, his expression tight with frustration. We've got a problem, he said. The main screen showed a distress signal. A small civilian transport ship, drifting near an asteroid field. They're under attack, one of the officers reported. A auxiliary raiding party is closing in on them. Elias' jaw tightened. Can we reach them in time? If we push the engines, yes, the helmsman replied. Kane crossed his arms. It's a trap. Elias glanced at Kazira. What do you think? She studied the data for a moment. Possibly. But if the auxiliary wanted to lure you into an ambush, they would not use civilians. This is a real attack. Elias nodded. Set a course. The Vanguard surged forward, engines roaring to life as it raced toward the distress signal. The auxiliary raiders were already firing on the helpless transport when they arrived. Lock weapons and fire, Elias commanded. The Vanguard's cannons roared, striking the enemy ships with precise force. 2 raiders were immediately disabled, and the others broke formation, realizing they were outgunned. Kazira studied their movements. They won't stay and fight. They'll retreat. As expected, the remaining auxiliary ships turned and jumped to hyperspace, abandoning the transport ship. Open a channel, Elias ordered. A shaky voice responded. This is Captain Lorne of the Starlight Dawn. Thank you. We wouldn't have survived without you. Elias gave a small smile. We're just glad we got here in time. Do you need medical assistance? We have some injured, Lorne admitted. We'll send a team, Elias said. Prepare to dock. Kazura turned to him. I want to go. Kane raised an eyebrow. You want to help? Kazura didn't look at him. She focused on Elias. Let me prove myself. Elias studied her, then nodded. Minutes later, Kazura stepped onto the civilian transport alongside the medical team. The humans inside flinched at the sight of her, fear flashing in their eyes. A small girl clung to her mother's side, staring at Kazura with wide, terrified eyes. Kazura hesitated. She had seen that look before, but never directed at her. She was the monster in their stories. A medic moved past her, kneeling beside an injured man. Kazura forced herself to move, stepping forward to assist. She wasn't a doctor, but she had battlefield experience. A man groaned in pain, clutching a deep wound on his side. Kazura knelt beside him, reaching for the medkit. The man flinched but didn't stop her as she applied pressure to the wound. You're helping, he whispered. She didn't answer. She just worked. An hour passed before all the injured were stable. Kazura stood up, looking around the ship. The fear in the civilians' eyes had softened into confusion. One little boy, no older than 6, hesitantly approached her. Are you a bad guy? Kazura stared at him, unsure how to answer. Before she could speak, Elias' voice crackled through her communicator. We're done here. Return to the ship. Kazura gave the boy a final glance before turning away. As she stepped onto the Vanguard, Kane was waiting for her. Well, he asked. Kazura met his gaze. They did not run from me. Kane studied her, then sighed. Maybe you're not as bad as I thought. She blinked, surprised by the words. Before she could reply, Kane turned and walked away. Kazura exhaled, a strange feeling settling in her chest. She had taken another step forward. And for the first time, she wasn't walking alone. The Vanguard moved through the vast emptiness of space, the battle scars on its hull a silent reminder of the struggles it had endured. The crew was quieter than usual, still adjusting to the idea of having Xelari among them, not as a prisoner, but as an ally. Kazura walked through the corridors, feeling the weight of the gazes on her. Some were curious, others distrustful. A few nodded at her in passing, a small sign that the walls between them were starting to crack. She had fought beside them. She had saved them. But she knew that trust was not won in a single moment. It had to be built, piece by piece. She entered the training bay, where Elias stood at the far end, practicing hand-to-hand combat against a training drone. His movements were sharp, precise. Even after everything, he remained focused, always ready for the next fight. You are skilled, she observed, stepping forward. Elias deactivated the drone and turned to her. Had to be. The Xelari don't give second chances. Kazura nodded. She understood that well. You still do not trust me. Elias studied her for a moment before replying. I trust actions more than words. Kazura stepped onto the training mat. Then fight me. Elias raised an eyebrow. You want to spar? I want to prove myself, she said firmly. Elias hesitated, then nodded. He took a stance, watching her carefully. Kazura mirrored him, her body tense but controlled. She moved first, striking fast. Elias barely dodged, countering with a quick jab. She blocked, twisting around him, her movements fluid and practiced. The fight was swift, a flurry of strikes and counters, neither gaining the upper hand. Kazura was stronger, but Elias was faster. He used his agility to keep her off balance, but she adapted, adjusting her attacks. Then, in a single moment, she caught his wrist, flipping him onto the mat. He landed hard, but instead of frustration, a grin spread across his face. You're good, he admitted. Kazura stepped back, offering a hand. He took it, pulling himself up. Do you trust my actions now? She asked. Elias exhaled, considering her words. You're proving yourself. Before Kazura could respond, the ship's alarm blared through the training bay. All hands to the bridge. Elias and Kazura exchanged a look before rushing out. When they arrived, Kane was already at his station, his expression tense. The main screen showed a massive auxiliary battleship emerging from hyperspace. "It's them," Kane muttered. "They came back." Elias clenched his jaw. "Weapons. Fully operational, but they outgun us," the weapons officer reported. Kazura stepped forward, eyes narrowing at the battleship. "This is not an attack force." Kane scoffed. "Looks like one to me." "No," Kazura insisted. "If they wanted to destroy us, they would have brought a fleet. This is something else." A moment later, the comms officer turned to Elias. "We're receiving a message from the Chilari ship." Elias hesitated. "Put it through." The screen flickered, revealing a Xilari commander in dark armor. His golden eyes locked onto Kazura, his expression unreadable. "Kazura," he said, his voice cold. "You have betrayed your kind." Kazura's hands clenched into fists. "I did what was right." The commander's gaze shifted to Elias. "Human, you are harboring a traitor to the Xilari Empire. Hand her over, and we will leave you in peace." Elias didn't even hesitate. "Not happening." The commander's expression darkened. "Then you are making an enemy of the Empire." Elias stepped forward. "She saved my crew. She saved civilians from your raiders. If protecting her makes me your enemy, so be it." Kazura felt a strange warmth in her chest at his words. The Xilari commander stared for a long moment before speaking again. "You are a fool." The transmission ended. "Captain," the weapons officer said urgently. "They're charging weapons." Elias didn't flinch. "Shields up. Prepare to fight." Kazura looked at the screen, studying the enemy ship's formation. They weren't here to negotiate. They had already decided to attack. She turned to Elias. "I can help." He glanced at her. "I know." The battle began. The vanguard weaved through enemy fire, dodging the massive blasts from the battleship. But the auxiliary ship was too powerful, its shields barely weakening under their attacks. "We can't win a straight fight," Kane shouted. Kazura's mind raced. She thought back to everything she knew about auxiliary ships, their weaknesses, their strategies. Then an idea struck her. "Captain," she said urgently, "target their sensor array. If we blind them, we can escape." Elias nodded. "Weapons," you heard her. The vanguard fired a concentrated volley at the enemy sensors. Sparks erupted across the auxiliary ship as its targeting systems flickered. "They're losing lock on us," the helmsman reported. Elias seized the moment. "Full speed, get us out of here." The vanguard surged forward, breaking away from the auxiliary's attack range. Moments later, they jumped to hyperspace. The tension on the bridge eased as they left the enemy far behind. Elias turned to Kazura, a small smile on his lips. "You just saved us again." Kazura met his gaze. "I told you, my fight is with you now." Kane shook his head, but there was no hostility in his expression anymore. "Well, I guess you're one of us." Kazura felt something shift inside her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She belonged. And she would fight for this crew, not as a Xilari, not as an outsider, but as one of them.